The autumn wind carried the scent of rain through the corridors of Clarence House, stirring the heavy curtains that had witnessed decades of royal history. Camilla stood before the tall window in her private sitting room, her reflection a ghost against the gray London sky. At 77, she had weathered storms that would have broken women half her age: the public scorn, the comparisons to Diana, the years of waiting in the shadows. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for this morning. The official letter had arrived at 7:15, delivered not by a trusted equerry, but by a junior aide who could barely meet her eyes. The cream-colored envelope bore the royal crest, but the handwriting inside was unmistakably that of the king's private secretary. The language was formal, precise, and utterly devastating. And her presence was no longer required at any royal residence. She was to vacate Clarence House by noon. Security protocols had been updated. Her passes would be deactivated effective immediately. Camilla had read the words 3 times before their meaning finally pierced through the fog of disbelief. 30 years. 3 decades of her life had been poured into this family, into this man, into the impossible dream of a life together. She had endured the rotten vegetables thrown by crowds in the early days. She had swallowed the cruel nicknames and the vicious editorials. She had stood beside Charles through his mother's death, through his ascension to the throne, through the sacred moment when the crown had touched both their heads. And this was how it ended. Not with a confrontation, not with a conversation, but with a cold letter delivered by a boy who looked like he wanted to flee the room. The morning hours passed in a blur of mechanical activity. Camilla moved through her rooms like a sleepwalker, selecting items with trembling hands. The silver-framed photograph of her grandchildren went into a worn leather bag. The small oil painting of her beloved Jack Russell, Bluebell, followed. But most of what surrounded her, the antique furniture selected by royal decorators, the art chosen to complement the palace collection, the gifts from foreign dignitaries, none of it was truly hers. She had lived in these houses for years, but she had never been allowed to forget that they belonged to the crown, not to her. By 11:30, the first of the palace protection officers arrived. 2 men in dark suits stood in the hallway, on their faces professionally blank. They did not speak to her, did not acknowledge the woman who had been their queen consort just 24 hours earlier. They were there to ensure compliance with the king's order, nothing more. Camilla descended the main staircase for the last time, her heels clicking against the marble that had echoed with the footsteps of royalty for nearly 2 centuries. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her pass, kings and queens and consorts whose faces held no judgment, no comfort, only the cold indifference of history. At the bottom of the stairs, she found the household staff assembled in an awkward line. Some wept openly, others stared at the floor, unable to witness the humiliation before them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, stepped forward with red-rimmed eyes and pressed a small wrapped package into Camilla's hands. "From all of us, Your Majesty," she whispered, the title catching in her throat. "We'll never forget your kindness." Camilla wanted to respond, wanted to thank these people who had served her with loyalty and warmth for years. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. The tears that had threatened all morning finally broke through, hot and uncontrollable, streaming down cheeks that decades of public scrutiny had trained to remain composed. The senior protection officer checked his watch with pointed emphasis. "Ma'am, the vehicle is waiting." The word "ma'am" instead of "Your Majesty" struck like a physical blow. Already the titles were being stripped away. Already she was becoming nobody again. The front door opened, and the November air rushed in, cold and unforgiving. Beyond the wrought iron gates, Camilla could see the flash of cameras. Someone had leaked the story. Of course someone had leaked the story. In the palace, secrets were currency, and this was the richest payday in years. As she stepped onto the portico, the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. The guards flanking the entrance stared straight ahead, but their presence was a silent condemnation. They were not there to protect her, they were there to ensure she left. The car idled at the bottom of the steps, a modest vehicle utterly unlike the royal limousines that had transported her for decades. Even in this, there was deliberate humiliation. Camilla's legs threatened to give way. She gripped the iron railing, her knuckles white against the black metal, and for one terrible moment she could not move forward. The cameras captured everything, the tears, the trembling hands, the broken posture of a woman who had finally, after all these years, been defeated. The headlines would write themselves. Camilla cast out. The end of the Queen Consort. Charles's cruel revenge. But the cameras could not capture what was happening inside her, the memories that flooded through her mind in that frozen moment. Meeting Charles at a polo match in 1970. Young and careless, and utterly unaware that she had just encountered the man who would define her entire existence. The years of friendship, of longing, of impossible love. The phone calls in the dark while he was married to another woman. The tabloid headlines that called her every vile name imaginable. The slow, painful rehabilitation orchestrated by publicists and palace aides. The wedding, not in a cathedral but in a civil ceremony, a compromise that spoke volumes about her permanent status as second best. The moment of coronation, when she had actually believed, perhaps naively, that she had finally arrived, finally been accepted, finally belonged. And now this. The senior protection officer approached her, his expression flickering with something that might have been pity. "Ma'am, you really must go now." Something in his voice, the gentleness beneath the official duty, broke the paralysis. Camilla drew herself up as straight as her aging spine would allow. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, an undignified gesture that would fuel 1,000 social media posts. But she was past caring about dignity. Dignity was a luxury for people who still had something left to lose. She walked down the steps, each one a small death. The car door opened, held by a young policeman who refused to meet her eyes. She climbed inside, the leather seat cold against her legs. Through the tinted window, she watched Clarence House recede. The home that had never truly been hers, the life that had never fully accepted her, the dream that had curdled into this waking nightmare. As the car pulled away, Camilla turned the small package from Mrs. Patterson over in her hands. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple silver bookmark engraved with a single word: courage. The tears came again, but now they were different. These tears carried the weight of gratitude, of human connection in a world that had suddenly become cold and institutional. The staff, and the people who had seen her at her worst and her most vulnerable, had given her something the royals never could: genuine affection. The car wound through London traffic, anonymous and ordinary. No motorcycle outriders cleared their path. No one on the pavements recognized the woman behind the darkened glass. She was already becoming invisible, already fading into the vast population of former somebodies who had learned that fame was a temporary lease, not a permanent residence. Camilla closed her eyes and let the motion of the car carry her toward an unknown future. She had no idea where she was going. The letter had not specified a destination, only that she must leave. Somewhere, she supposed, there would be a house, perhaps one of the properties she had owned before marriage, before royalty, before everything became complicated. Somewhere, there would be a bed to sleep in, walls to contain her, a door that locked against the world. But there would also be silence. The silence of phones that no longer rang with calls from the palace. The silence of mornings without a schedule packed with engagements and duties. The silence of evenings without Charles beside her, without the familiar rhythm of royal life that had structured her existence for so long. She thought of him then, the man she had loved for more than 50 years, the man who had just exiled her from everything. What was he feeling at this moment? Was he sitting in his study at Buckingham Palace, staring at the same gray sky, feeling the weight of what he had done? Or had he already moved on, already convinced himself that this was necessary, that she had brought it upon herself? The car turned onto the motorway, heading west toward the countryside. Camilla watched the city dissolve into suburbs, then fields, then the rolling hills of the English countryside she had always loved. Somewhere out there, in the quiet places where tourists never ventured, she would have to find a way to be Camilla again, not the queen, not the consort, not the other woman, but simply herself. The afternoon light was fading when the car finally turned down a long gravel drive. Camilla recognized the house, a small manor in Wiltshire that had belonged to her family for generations. It had been rented out for years, but apparently someone had arranged for its emptying, for its preparation. Another kindness from someone she might never know. The car stopped. The driver opened her door. Camilla stepped out into the cold evening air and looked at the house before her. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Stone walls, climbing roses gone dormant for winter, lights burning warm in the windows. It was not a palace. It was not even particularly grand. But it was, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, hers. She walked toward the front door, carrying her meager belongings, and did not look back. The first night in the Wiltshire house passed in a strange suspension of time. Camilla had not slept, could not sleep, though exhaustion pressed against her bones like a physical weight. She had wandered through the rooms instead, touching surfaces, opening cabinets, discovering the accumulated detritus of decades left behind by previous occupants. The house had been hastily prepared. Someone had made the bed with fresh linens, stocked the refrigerator with basic provisions, left a fire laid in the drawing-room grate. But it still smelled of emptiness, of long years when no one had truly lived within these walls. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would not hide. She would not slink away into comfortable obscurity while the world wrote her obituary in real time. If she was to be destroyed, she would at least face her destruction with open eyes. The television in the small sitting room brought the outside world flooding in. Every channel carried the story. Camilla watched herself on screen, the frozen moment on the Clarence House steps, the tears, the trembling hands, the final descent into the waiting car. The commentators dissected her with clinical precision. And they spoke of palace sources and insiders and those close to the king. They debated the reasons for her removal with the confidence of people who knew nothing: affairs, theft, mental instability, a long-simmering feud with the Prince of Wales. Each theory was presented as fact, each speculation delivered with the same gravity as verified news. She turned off the television and sat in the sudden silence, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the old house, the creak of timbers, the whisper of wind through chimneys, the distant bark of a farm dog. Somewhere in that silence, a phone began to ring. It was not her mobile, which sat dark and useless on the coffee table. She had not turned it on since leaving London, afraid of what messages might await. This was a landline, an ancient thing mounted on the kitchen wall. Its bell shrill and insistent in the quiet morning. Camilla hesitated. Who even knew this number? She had not been to this house in years, had barely remembered its existence until yesterday. The ringing continued. On the 7th ring, she lifted the receiver. "Camilla!" The voice was unmistakable. 50 years of intimacy could not be disguised by distance or technology. Charles, her Charles, the king. "You shouldn't call here," she said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "They'll be monitoring everything now." "I don't care what they monitor." He sounded tired, older than his years, burdened by weights she could only imagine. "I had to hear your voice." "Then you've heard it." She gripped the receiver so tightly, her fingers ached. Was there something else? A long pause stretched between them, and filled with the crackle of the connection and the weight of everything unsaid. When Charles spoke again, his voice had changed, softer, more vulnerable. The voice of the man she had loved before crowns and duties had claimed him. "I didn't want this. You have to believe that." "I believe that you signed the order." Camilla leaned against the kitchen counter, her eyes fixed on nothing. "I believe that your private secretary delivered it. I believe that your protection officers escorted me from the home where I've lived for 18 years. What else should I believe, Charles? There were circumstances. There are always circumstances." She cut him off, not with anger, but with a weariness that felt older than time. "There were circumstances when you married Diana. There were circumstances when you kept me in the shadows for decades. Now there were circumstances when your mother refused to meet me. There were always circumstances, and I always accepted them. I always understood. I always waited. And I loved you for it. Did you?" The question hung in the air between them. "Or did you love that I waited, that I was always there, always patient, always willing to put my life on hold for yours?" Charles was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion she had rarely heard from him. "I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know how to be king without you beside me. You'll learn." Camilla's voice was gentle now, despite everything. "You'll learn because you have to. That's what we do, isn't it? We learn to live without the people we thought we couldn't live without. I should have fought for you. I should have told them all." "Told them what? That you chose me?" "You did choose me, Charles. 30 years ago, you chose me. But choosing someone and protecting them are different things." She closed her eyes, letting the truth of her own words wash over her. "You chose me to love in secret. You chose me to wait in shadows. You chose me to be your companion when no one was watching. But when the watching became too intense, when the pressure became too great, you chose yourself instead. That's not fair." "Fair?" A laugh escaped her, hollow and broken. "Fair went out the window in 1981 when you married a woman you didn't love because your family demanded it. Fair died in that tunnel in Paris with Diana. Fair has been buried under decades of compromise and duty and doing what must be done. Don't speak to me of fair." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Camilla could hear Charles breathing on the other end, could picture him in his study at Buckingham Palace, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had made their own terrible choices, their own impossible compromises. "Come back," he said finally. "Just come back, and we'll find a way through this together." "I can't." The words cost her everything, but she spoke them anyway. "If I come back now, I come back on their terms. I come back as someone who was banished and then forgiven, who exists at the pleasure of the palace and the press. I've lived that life for 30 years, Charles. I can't live it anymore." Then what will you do?" Camilla looked around the kitchen, the old Aga stove, the worn flagstones. The window overlooking fields that had belonged to her family for generations. She thought of the silver bookmark in her pocket, the gift from servants who had shown her more kindness than kings ever had. "I'll learn to live," she said, "really live. Not as a character in other people's stories, not as a symbol or a scandal or a headline, just as myself, for whatever time I have left. Camilla. Goodbye, Charles." She spoke the words softly, without bitterness. "Take care of yourself. Take care of them all. And if you ever truly loved me, let me go." She placed the receiver back on its cradle and stood for a long moment in the quiet kitchen. The morning sun had begun to stream through the window, painting golden rectangles on the flagstones. Somewhere outside, a bird sang with the mindless joy of creatures who had never heard of royalty or scandal or broken hearts. Camilla walked to the window and looked out at the day ahead. It was, she realized, the first day of the rest of her life, whatever that meant now. The weeks that followed blurred into a strange, unstructured rhythm. Camilla woke each morning without an alarm, without a schedule, without the army of assistants who had once managed every moment of her existence. She made her own tea, a small act of rebellion that felt almost illicit after decades of having everything done for her. She walked the fields around the house, her boots sinking into the damp English earth, her lungs filling with air that carried no trace of London's pollution or the palace's politics. The outside world continued to churn with speculation. Camilla followed it intermittently, picking up fragments from newspapers and television reports, but the story no longer felt like it belonged to her. The commentators debated whether she would fight the banishment, whether she would seek a divorce, whether she would write a memoir that might bring down the monarchy. They conjured scenarios and assigned motives, constructing elaborate narratives from the flimsiest of evidence. None of them came close to the truth, which was far simpler and far more complicated than any of them imagined. The truth was that Camilla was learning for the first time in her adult life to be alone. Not lonely, though loneliness visited her often, especially in the long evenings when the house grew dark and the silence pressed in, but simply alone, unobserved, unjudged, unscripted. As she discovered things about herself that 50 years of public life had obscured. She liked to garden, really garden, with her hands in the soil and dirt beneath her fingernails. She liked to cook, simple meals without the interference of chefs and nutritionists, and palace protocols. She liked to read for hours at a time, losing herself in novels that had nothing to do with history or biography or the endless parade of royal literature. And she thought about the past. She thought about it constantly, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. The early days with Charles, when they had been young and careless and convinced that love would conquer everything. The terrible years after his marriage, when she had been cast as the villain in a fairy tale gone wrong. The slow, painful rehabilitation, orchestrated by publicists who understood that the only way to save her reputation was to make her invisible. The coronation, when she had knelt before the altar and felt for one dizzying moment that she had finally been accepted. She thought about Diana most of all. Not the Diana of myth and legend, the saintly figure who had been elevated to near divinity by her tragic death, but the real Diana. Complicated, wounded, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind. They had met only a handful of times, always in circumstances so charged with tension that normal human interaction was impossible. But Camilla remembered one moment, years before the end, when their eyes had met across a crowded room at some official function. For just a heartbeat, the masks had slipped, and they had seen each other as what they truly were. Two women caught in the same impossible trap, competing for the love of a man who belonged to neither of them, but to an institution that consumed everything it touched. What would Diana think of all this? Camilla wondered. Would she feel vindicated, watching from whatever afterlife existed? Would she pity the woman who had finally been cast out, just as she herself had been cast out decades earlier? Or would she simply shrug and turn away, uninterested in the continued dramas of a family that had destroyed her? The questions had no answers, and Camilla eventually stopped asking them. The past was past. The dead were dead. The living had to find a way forward. In the third week of her exile, she received an unexpected visitor. The knock came on a gray afternoon when she was deep in the garden, her hands covered in soil, her hair escaping from its pins in wild gray strands. She considered ignoring it. Whoever it was would eventually go away, but some instinct pulled her toward the door. Prince William stood on her doorstep. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Camilla stared at the man before her, 30 years old now, with his father's features and his mother's eyes, the heir to the throne that had just expelled her. He was not in uniform, not accompanied by aides or protection officers. He was simply William, standing in the cold, looking at her with an expression she could not read. "May I come in?" he asked. Camilla stepped aside without speaking, and he walked past her into the small entrance hall. And he looked around at the modest space, the worn floorboards, the simple furnishings, the muddy boots by the door, with an expression she had seen on countless visitors to this house. Disbelief that the queen consort, even a deposed one, could live in such ordinary surroundings. "Tea?" she offered because she could think of nothing else to say. "I didn't come for tea." "No. I suppose you didn't." She led him into the sitting room where a fire smoldered in the grate. "Sit down, then. Or don't. Whatever you prefer." William chose a chair by the window, positioning himself so the light fell across his face. A deliberate choice, Camilla recognized, one that allowed her to see his expressions clearly while his own remained partially shadowed. He had learned the arts of royal negotiation well. "I know what they're saying about you," he began. "The press, the palace sources, all of them." "I'm sure you do." Camilla sat across from him, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "You probably know more than I do. I've stopped reading." "You should read this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, holding it out to her. "It's the full report. The investigation that led to your removal." Camilla stared at the papers in his hand, but did not reach for them. "Why would you bring me this?" "Because you deserve to know the truth." His voice was steady, but something flickered in those eyes that were so like his mother's. Not the version they're feeding the press, not the rumors and speculation, the actual findings. "And you have access to these findings?" "I have access to everything now." The words carried weight far beyond their surface meaning. William was positioning himself, Camilla realized. He was preparing for a future that might come sooner than anyone expected. Slowly, she reached out and took the document. She did not open it, merely held it in her lap, feeling the weight of pages that contained the official explanation for her destruction. "Why now?" she asked. "Why, after all these years, did they decide I had to go?" William leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "It wasn't one thing. That's what the report makes clear. It was 1,000 things accumulated over decades. Your approval ratings, which never recovered after certain events, the tension between you and various members of the family, and the pressure from Parliament, from the press, from the public, The sense that the monarchy needed to modernize and that you were a symbol of everything that couldn't be modernized. I was a symbol. Camilla heard the hollow note in her own voice. Not a person. A symbol. Yes. William did not flinch from the truth. That's what we all are. In the end. Symbols. And symbols can be replaced. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Camilla looked down at the document in her hands, then back at the young man who had just delivered it. "Why you?" she asked. "Why did you come instead of sending someone?" William's composure cracked, just slightly, just for an instant. In that moment, Camilla saw the boy he had been, the child who had lost his mother too young. Oh, who had grown up under the weight of expectations no human should bear, who had learned to hide his feelings behind a mask of royal duty. "Because I know what it's like," he said quietly, "to be pushed out, to be told you don't belong anymore, to have the institution turn on you after you've given everything to it." He was talking about his mother. He was talking about Diana. Pushed to the margins, stripped of her title, left to navigate a hostile world alone. The parallel hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. "Your mother and I were not friends," Camilla said carefully. "You know that better than anyone." "I know." William nodded. "But you loved my father. You loved him in a way that cost you everything, just as my mother loved him in a way that cost her everything. You were both casualties of the same war." The tears came before Camilla could stop them, not the hot, bitter tears of her eviction day, but something softer, more healing. William did not move to comfort her, did not offer the false solace of empty words. He simply sat, present and witnessing, allowing her to feel what she needed to feel. When she had composed herself, she looked at him with new eyes. "You're a better man than they give you credit for. I've had good teachers." He stood, preparing to leave. "Read the report. Burn it if you want. Keep it if you want. Do whatever you need to do with it. But know the truth. You deserve at least that." At the door, he paused and turned back. "Camilla." It was the first time he had ever used her name without a title. "Whatever happens next, whatever they say about you, remember this. You lasted longer than anyone expected. You survived things that would have destroyed most people. That counts for something." Then he was gone, walking down the gravel drive toward a car she hadn't noticed, leaving her alone with the document that held the official story of her downfall. That night, by the fire, Camilla read every word. The document told a story she recognized but had never seen assembled in one place. It traced her life with clinical detachment, the early friendship with Charles, the affair that had coincided with his marriage, the years of tabloid persecution, the gradual rehabilitation, the marriage, the coronation. But interspersed with the facts were interpretations, judgments, conclusions drawn by people who had never spoken to her, never asked her side of anything. She was described as divisive and controversial. Her approval ratings were charted against those of Diana, the comparison implicit and damning. Her relationships with other family members were analyzed for signs of tension, friction, dysfunction. Her public appearances were scrutinized for moments of awkwardness, error, failure. The final section, the one that had apparently triggered her removal, focused on the future. Polling data showed that her presence would continue to depress support for the monarchy, particularly among younger generations. Strategic advisors had concluded that the institution's long-term survival required a refresh of its public image, and that refresh could not include her. The king had been presented with options, and after extended consultation with family members and advisors, he had chosen the most decisive. What the document did not contain was any acknowledgement of the human cost. Nowhere did it mention the decades of loyalty The personal sacrifices, the love that had sustained a relationship through impossible circumstances. Nowhere did it note that she had never sought this life, had never asked to be queen, had simply loved a man who happened to be born to the most visible position in the world. Camilla closed the report and placed it on the table beside her. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, wind rattled the windows, carrying the first hints of winter. She thought about calling Charles. The impulse was almost overwhelming, to reach out, to hear his voice, to find some comfort in the only person who truly understood what she had lost. But she remembered their last conversation, the weight of everything unsaid between them, and she knew that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Instead, she picked up the silver bookmark that Mrs. Patterson had given her and traced the engraved word with her fingertip. Courage. It was easy to be courageous when the world was watching, when cameras captured every brave face and noble gesture. It was harder to be courageous in the long, empty hours when no one was watching, when courage meant simply continuing to exist, to breathe, to put one foot in front of the other. The weeks that followed brought their own revelations. Camilla began to hear from people she had not thought of in years. Old friends who had been pushed aside by royal protocol. Distant relatives who had watched her rise and fall from afar, and even strangers who had been moved by her story and wanted her to know that someone, somewhere, still believed in her humanity. She answered none of them at first, then some of them, then more. She discovered that she had something she had never possessed before. Time. Time to listen. Time to respond. Time to simply be present with people who asked nothing from her but her attention. The house in Wiltshire began to feel less like exile and more like sanctuary. She planted bulbs in the garden, knowing they would bloom in spring, making a commitment to a future she could not yet imagine. She adopted a dog from a local shelter, a scruffy terrier mix with intelligent eyes and a wounded past that mirrored her own. She named him Arthur, after the legendary king who had also known the pain of betrayal. And she wrote, not a memoir, and not an exposé, but simply words on paper, thoughts about her life, her choices, her regrets, and joys. She wrote about love and loss and the strange grace of growing old. She wrote about the people she had known, the places she had seen, the moments that had shaped her. She wrote for herself alone, with no thought of publication or legacy, and in the writing, she found a peace she had never known. One evening in late winter, as snow fell softly outside her window, Camilla received another unexpected visitor. This time it was not a prince but a woman, middle-aged, professionally dressed, carrying a leather briefcase that spoke of purpose and authority. "Your Majesty," the woman began, then corrected herself. "Mrs. Parker Bowles. Thank you for seeing me." Camilla had not used that name in years, but something in the woman's respectful delivery made it feel like a gift rather than a demotion. "Please, come in, though I should warn you, I'm not receiving many visitors these days." The woman introduced herself as a literary agent representing a publishing house that had been trying to reach Camilla for months. They were interested in her story, her real story, not the tabloid versions. They wanted to give her a platform to speak for herself, to answer the decades of speculation with her own truth. "I'm not interested in revenge," Camilla said carefully. "I'm not interested in settling scores or exposing secrets." The agent nodded. "I understand, but there's a difference between revenge and truth, between settling scores and setting the record straight. Your life has been public property for 50 years. Don't you think you deserve the chance to tell your own version?" Camilla looked out the window at the falling snow. She thought of Charles, alone in his palaces, carrying the weight of a crown that had cost him everything. She thought of William, the unexpected ally who had brought her the truth. She thought of Diana, forever young in the public imagination, frozen in time while the living had to age and change and eventually die. And she thought of herself, the girl who had fallen in love at a polo match, the woman who had waited decades for happiness, the queen who had reigned for barely a year before being cast aside. What did she owe any of them? What did she owe the institution that had consumed her life and then discarded her? "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's the best I can offer." The agent left her card and departed into the snowy night. Camilla stood at the window for a long time, watching the flakes fall and disappear into the darkness. Somewhere out there, the world continued to spin, continued to generate scandals and headlines and dramas that would be forgotten in a week. But here, in this small house in Wiltshire, something new was taking root. Something that had nothing to do with palaces or crowns or the endless machinery of royal life. Spring would come eventually. The bulbs would bloom. The dog would grow old and faithful. And Camilla, for the first time in her long and complicated life, would discover who she was when no one was watching. The truth, she was learning, was not always kind, but it was, in the end, the only thing that could not be taken away.